talk through some of the different types of cost sharing in more detail. Mandatory cost sharing is required by the sponsor, right? It's an eligibility criteria. If you are not willing to provide cost sharing, you're not eligible to submit a proposal. It's always demonstrated in the proposal in a dollar value. It's typically explicitly referenced in an award document. I myself have seen one or two instances where mandatory cost sharing, the budget, was not explicitly referenced in an award document, but I think that's sort of 80-20 rule, or probably 99-1. Most of the time you're going to see it explicitly referenced in an award document. And then, of course, as we all know, it must be properly documented and tracked for cost accounting and compliance purposes. Voluntary committed cost sharing is not required by the sponsor, but it's demonstrated in the proposal. And so this is a choice that an institution makes to put cost sharing in. And we can do this in a few different ways, but for something to be voluntary committed cost sharing, it should be demonstrated in the proposal. I would note here that you may have instances, these are relatively rare, where someone or an organization generally elects to put cost sharing in at maybe a revised budget stage. That's very unusual, but if it is documented and presented to the sponsor at any sort of point in the process and gets incorporated, we would view that as something that would go sort of move to the line of voluntary and committed cost sharing. And I make that note as I'm going to discuss voluntary uncommitted and the differences there in one moment. So voluntary committed cost sharing is sometimes referenced in the award document, but whether or not it's referenced explicitly in the award document, unless there's been a further exchange or dialogue with the sponsor on this, documented dialogue, it must be properly documented and tracked for cost accounting and compliance purposes. And so when you think about voluntary committed cost sharing and compare it to mandatory cost sharing, you'll see that there's a lot of similarities, generally speaking, but where the similarities get the most clear is once you have an award in place, because then in both scenarios you need to make sure you are monitoring, tracking, documenting, and reporting on the cost share. With a voluntary situation, you may have less of an ongoing requirement to report on cost sharing in terms of how you're doing. That could be true. You may even have a situation where you don't actually have to report formally on the cost sharing at all, but you do need to make sure that you are tracking on it. And then the third general type of cost sharing is voluntary uncommitted cost sharing. So voluntary uncommitted cost sharing is not required. It's then not demonstrated in the proposal. It's not referenced in the award document, right, because it wasn't required or demonstrated in the proposal or any sort of just-in-time or revised budget stage leading up to the issuance of the award document. And then it is not formally tracked or auditable. I think one of the questions that people sort of say sometimes is, well, why don't you want to track on uncommitted cost sharing? And I think that's a good question. You know, generally speaking, you don't want to track on voluntary uncommitted cost sharing from the perspective that you don't want to sort of be classifying it as formal cost sharing because of some of the financial impacts, including F&A rate impact. But I would say that it's an institution by institution decision as to whether or not you want to track on all the uncommitted cost sharing you're doing off the books, right? Not representing it as cost sharing you'd want to put in your F&A rate agreement. And that can be a difficult consideration, especially given the amount of uncommitted cost sharing that occurs all the time, even getting back to thinking about the interplay between the revenues and the costs associated with conducting sponsored programs. I would also say that I think, you know, one of the most common types of uncommitted cost sharing you see on a routine basis is faculty effort in excess of the amount originally committed potentially, or where they're not actually charging the sponsored project, but they originally planned to.